And we're back again. This is going to be a little bit different, coming off the back of off the back of Kara's one, where we're looking at we don't need no more stinking data, making ID data practical rather than just plentiful. If, like me, you love data but get slightly depressed by the quality of it in your business, I'm sure you'll be looking forward to this. I know I am. Anja, without further ado, over to you. I'll get off the screen.
Hi there. If you can't hear me, let me know. Oh, hi. My name is Anja, and I am very, very, very passionate about data. And one thing that I've noticed as I was getting more acquainted with the learning and development community over the past year was that data is kind of a problem, good data in particular. So I started thinking about ways to bring more good data into training and learning and development. And so I will be talking about this today. One thing that I want to say right off the bat is that these are the thoughts that I'm sharing with you are based on my experience and my discussions with other people, but they may certainly not cover every scenario. So just to make that disclaimer. To start out with, I think we always ask ourselves when it comes to data, what should we measure? And it struck me that when I've been looking at training data, a lot of it is low-hanging fruit. So if you look at the Kirkpatrick model, which has those 4 categories, starting with reaction, learning, and then behavior and impact, a lot of it happens at the first 2, maybe the 3rd levels. And, you know, I have nothing against Kirkpatrick, but I think it's a bit problematic when you basically have a model that has 4 levels, and in reality, it's that 4th level that is almost never measured. Okay, that's a bit strong, but it tends to be the least measured. But it is also, at least in my view, the most important level. What impact are we creating with the learning and development that we put together, with the training that we put together? So if you look at, for instance, as an example, your LMS, if you do use one, you can see things like overall utilization rates, login rates, course completion rates, video completion rates, trainee satisfaction, and so on and so forth. And that is really more at the 1st and 2nd levels of the Kirkpatrick model. If you have a very sophisticated, and let me be a little tongue-in-cheek and put that word sophisticated in quotation marks, LMS or expensive LMS, they might actually help you gather some data at the 3rd level. But that 4th level is really sort of elusive. And that is, as a side note, why I personally have not been very impressed with LMSs that I've come across. So the conclusion I kind of came to, and hopefully some of you also, is that it doesn't really matter how fancy your L&D tools are. If you're not measuring what really matters, you're driving blind. And we have to go beyond that low-hanging fruit of participation rates, test scores, retention, completion rates, course ratings, instructor ratings, and even some of that behavior that's being measured, because it is not really telling us how our training is affecting the bottom line. And that bottom line isn't always dollars, by the way. So I'm not really focused here in this talk on return on investment, although return on investment can be construed very broadly. But the things that are directly related to the training that you are providing. Now, going back to that question of what should we measure, I have a very simple process. It's deceptively simple. I start with two questions. One is, what's the problem that we need to solve? And as a lot of you probably know, that turns out to be sometimes a very difficult question to answer because the people involved sometimes don't know what the actual problem is. And that's okay. And that's what your needs analysis is for, right? So once you've got that figured out, hopefully, and you've got everyone on board, that is the people involved in the training and sponsoring the training, your stakeholders, then you can ask the question, well, how do we know that we've solved the problem? And this is probably the point where you're going to realize that those first two levels of Kirkpatrick are really not going to give you a whole lot of information, right? And to put it simply, for every measurement, okay, or every answer to this question, how do we know that we solved the problem? Ask, so what? So if someone suggests, well, we've had everybody complete the training and have perfect scores on their knowledge tests, and you ask, so what? That's going to hopefully prompt, well, what does that mean? What is that going to get us, so to speak? If everyone has perfect test scores, what can we do with that? And then so you kind of go through that continuous iteration process of asking, so what, until you get to the bottom line, which may be several things, as I will point out and when I go through specific examples in a minute. So really the crux, I think, is linking training outcomes to specific business outcomes. And so depending on what type of training you are developing, you want to figure out what are the business metrics that need to be impacted by this. And we have to do that before we actually design the training. And I think that's something that I find often gets lost even in the needs analysis, which is, yeah, okay, we can look at all these data points, but we are not necessarily even thinking about, well, if we're going to try to measure this, how do we have to design the training to be able to measure this? And sometimes you may realize that your, say, quizzes, and yes, I'm going to pick on quizzes and multiple choice and knowledge tests and all of that for a minute. aren't really going to get you very far, or may actually be irrelevant or not so relevant. So once we figured out how we know that we're going to have the problem solved, or some, not this isn't necessarily implying that you can always 100% solve the problem, or even point to training as the thing that solved the problem, right? Because there are a lot of factors often involved. Let me backtrack a little bit. When we're talking about what's the problem that we need to solve, I think it's always useful to look at all the factors that you can identify that may contribute to the problem, so you can situate training as a solution properly. And hopefully, the people who want training will realize that if training isn't going to solve the problem, they're not going to keep asking you to design training. But I realize that maybe doesn't happen sometimes. Anyway, so once we've got that figured out and we've got some ideas of business outcomes that could be impacted by the training that we're thinking of designing, and yeah, so once we've got those things, then we can look at where we can get the data, or we can also look at what other pieces of data may be useful that we don't currently have access to, or that we may even not know about. Okay. So from a data perspective, it may be the case that your department is somewhat siloed and you are not regularly connecting to other departments that have data that may be relevant to training outcomes. Or worse, the people who would like you to develop training may not have that data at all, or they may not be interested in measuring it. I don't want to talk too much about this right now, but it's certainly something, if you want to have me address that in the Q&A, how to deal with those situations, we can definitely do that. So there is, from a data perspective, there are two categories generally that you can look at. And the first one is what I would call hard data, and that's things like measuring outputs. So measuring outputs, say for instance in production, measuring cost, measuring time, measuring quality, if you have a system of measuring quality, which obviously you should have. And then there is soft data, and this is what I like to call squishy data. Actually, I'm going to call it squishy data instead of soft data. And that's things like attitudes, motivation, satisfaction. So subjective assessments, or mostly subjective assessments. Both of these categories, I think, are relevant and important. So just because I call it squishy data doesn't mean it's not any good. Although I do think that ideally we want to pull data pieces from both categories if we can. And there is oftentimes also an onus to look at whether the measurements for soft data are sound. So that's definitely something to consider or additionally think about when we're using soft data. So I've talked very theoretically, excuse me, coffee. Caffeine. I've talked very theoretical. So I want to talk about different training areas and give you some ideas of data to look at. I feel like I need to say this again about Kirkpatrick. I'm not saying that you shouldn't measure level 1 and 2 and even level 3. What I'm saying, though, is that it's not enough to do that. And you should develop a habit of looking at the impact part first. And that is also what you should focus on when you're developing the training and when you are helping, when you're trying to get, what's the word? Buy-in from your stakeholders. Okay, so let's look at training in onboarding, for instance. So onboarding might seem a little bit easier for you to wrap your head around in terms of data, because we can measure things like time to proficiency. So how long does it take someone to do a task that would be part of their job description, or or is something more than a task, an area in their job description? How long does it take them to be able to execute that? And time to full productivity, and that's a little bit more of a full, broader measurement. And it does rely on knowing good ways of measuring productivity in general. And obviously, it also depends on the job that's being performed, right? If a full productivity means developing 25 widgets in an hour, then that would mean full productivity. But in something like, say they are a marketing specialist, what does full productivity mean? Well, and by the way, this applies to all the areas that I'm going to talk about. That is really something that should be clearly defined in a job description, and that needs to be clearly communicated with an employee. So there is an HR and management component here that needs to be in place, and I realize that may not always be the case. Having had many jobs without a job description myself, I know the problem. But anyway, so you may have to kind of work through with the people involved, the managers and whatnot, if they don't have a good definition of what full productivity looks like. So that's these are some ideas for onboarding. There are probably more. Let's look at performance. Okay, so in a
Hey, Anja.
manufacturing environment, yeah.
Hey, just quickly before you move on from that point, we got a good question in from YouTube on a sort of similar thing. So if I pop that on screen, and it was about how to make sure that our virtual learners are getting a real learning experience in spite of disabilities, connectivity. Some learners are embarrassed to say. So that's just come through on the YouTube channel now. So I thought I would jump in and see what you thought.
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Can I table this until I'm done? It's just my autistic brain needs to stay on track.
No, that's absolutely fine. I will keep this in the Q&A, and we will come back to it at the end.
But that's a great question. Anyway, where was I? Performance. Okay. In a manufacturing environment, performance might, for instance, be things like how many widgets were produced, how many packages were put together, how many in a, say, retail environment or commerce environment, how many packages were shipped, how many patients were treated in, say, a healthcare environment, how fast people were So it's, for instance, in an emergency room, how long it took for patients to actually receive care. In an education environment, it might be how many students graduated. Anyway, so those are some performance measures you could think about for in that category. Another slightly, I think, fairly related one might be internal promotion rates, and that's obviously more of a long-term measure, but that could also speak to how effective your training is in terms of improving someone's performance and making them able to move up in the company. So going further, related to performance is production. Production category, and I'm not talking just about manufacturing here. It's, it could be an software engineering. Obviously, you're producing, so it could be a product that's physical. It could be a product that's virtual. It could be a service. But there are different measurements to look at, which is quality. Has quality improved? Have we fewer defects? Are we generating less waste? And as a certified Six Sigma Green Belt, those are things that you definitely look at in that respect. And by the way, slightly off track, but Six Sigma is actually a really good way to learn data measurement and thinking about what data to measure. Anyway, costs increased or gone down? Have production times increased or decreased? And something that I think is a bit more squishy is rate of innovation, but that might actually be very important if you are in an industry or if you're working in a company where innovation is really important to keep up with the competition. Another area that's often that often requires training, and I know that that's not a that's training that we often don't like to design, but it is safety and compliance. And so on the compliance side, I realized that a lot of times we kind of get stuck at that first level, right? Because some of these compliance things are regulatory issues. They're mandated. And for instance, I work in financial services. We have things like continuing education credits that we need to complete, and that's measured by hours to keep our licensing, for instance. So that's very low level measurement, right? Even though it is training. Safety, for instance, would be number of incidents, safety incidents, time to resolve those incidents, etc. Then we get to things that might be even more important when you're looking at jobs like I was mentioning earlier, like say a marketing specialist. You're training someone in marketing methodology or sales methodology. So sales, for instance, would be, here are some measurements to think about: number of leads generated, size of pipeline, quotas, the size of a deal, the time it takes to close a deal, the funnel velocity, and that's just, from beginning of when you get a lead or when you get a lead all the way to close. So there are a number of metrics here, and in sales, oftentimes, and I'm going to give financial services as an example again, are tied to compensation also. So you probably are going to have pretty good access to that type of data. And then there is another example that I wanted to mention, and that's customer service. So customer service can be measured by a bunch of different things, but I often see things like customer ratings, like customer satisfaction ratings. You can measure something called Net Promoter Score. Although I do have a little bit of a beef with an NPS, and that's a side note, and someone wants to ask me about it. But anyway, it's used by a lot of companies. The repeat business metric might be a good one to look at. In other words, are customers coming back? The response time to a customer service issue, the resolution time, and this I see a lot in a call center environment. How many calls does it take for someone to get their issue resolved? So those might be things to look at in the customer service environment. So I kind of threw a lot at you, and I wanted to leave a fair bit of time for questions. And I realize that you may be overwhelmed by everything I just talked about, but I promise that in the near future, there will actually be a quick guide available on my LinkedIn. And shameless self-promotion, please connect with me on LinkedIn. So I'll leave all of that here, and then we can go to question. I don't know, Tom, do you want me to answer that first question about accessibility?
Yeah. Let me bring that back up. That was brilliant, by the way. Really, really great, and I'm very much looking forward to that quick guide. This is a topic where like good guidance material is actually quite tricky to find. For those of us that don't have like a very sort of established background of data and a technical understanding of it, that will be really helpful. Show on stage. There we go. So yeah, we were looking at from a virtual learner perspective, how do we make sure they get a real learning experience despite disabilities, connectivity issues, some learners not wanting to say, "Hey, I've got there's this challenge here." So yeah, it'd be great to get your input.
So I think that a lot of times we have to kind of start with a low-hanging fruit on that, which is, if you're looking at how a learner rates their training experience. So if you're seeing anomalies in how in reports about the training, in ratings, etc., that would be something to dig into and further explore. So this is one of those things, we create these training surveys, and a lot of times we take that data, and if it makes us look good, then that's what we're reporting. If it makes us look not so good, then we try not to report it, or we try not to deal with it too much. But looking at those pieces and taking that actually as an input to dig further, I think is really important to discover if in your training design something needs to be changed. There is, of course, this disclosure issue, and I will say, as someone who is autistic and therefore has a disability, that is a big can of worms, because people don't necessarily want to self-report, and people like me also don't necessarily want to ask for accommodation because we don't want to draw attention to ourselves, and we don't want to burden other people. But I think the best way and long-term way to address that is through company culture. And there's another squishy word, because, and I think as learning and development people, we can spearhead that and create environments where people feel comfortable to talk about these things. And I think that is something that we want to really press. Another thing to think about is also to bring in experts or to consult with experts. If you think accessibility is something that you in general need to work on for your training, will you be able to create training where nobody's going to have an issue for one reason or another? I don't think so. But those are definitely steps you want to take if you realize that this is really important. And just one more thing, I think training in general, and this is my soapbox speech for the day, needs to be designed with accessibility first in mind and not as an afterthought. And that's unfortunately still what is happening a lot. So you may have to rethink how you're approaching the design aspect of your training from the beginning.
I think that's a really great point. And actually, there's another question coming from YouTube. YouTube is on it today. Let's put that on the stage. We've got. I'm terrible with names and pronunciations, as Anja knows from when we first met. I'm gonna go with Andre, and that's going to be wrong. And you can shout at me on YouTube, and that's fine. I deserve it. But for now, Andre from YouTube asks, if the focus is on innovation and not on the problem, what should the question look like and what kind of data would you take?
Forgive me for being a bit nitpicky with this question, but if the focus is not on the problem, then you need to reshift your focus, because training should solve a problem for obvious reasons. But I do see a lot of training, unfortunately, that's kind of sort of geared at something broad. But you often find yourself thinking, well, what was the point of this? So I don't know, maybe that was kind of part of what this person was asking. In terms of innovation, I think this really, really depends on the industry that you're in. And in that industry, there may be quote unquote standards, and there may be your competitors may have you may be able to look at your competitors to see what's the word for benchmarks. That's what I was thinking about. But innovation is a squishy thing in some sense. And so that's why I'm saying it really depends on the industry. If we're looking at, and this is just one example, it's an imperfect example, at app development. Okay. If we're developing an app and for a particular purpose, we may want to think about innovation in terms of how often we upgrade and bring new features to this app. Okay, and then we may look at how training may be able to impact that. If I'm a software engineer working on an app, it might actually be a matter of upskilling in my coding skills, for instance, in order to be able to come up with more feature ideas or ways to implement features that customers have asked for. So that's one example I could think of. But it does really depend on what industry and what company and what product we're talking about when we need to define innovation. Tom, you're still on mute.
There we are. I'm back. There we go. It was going to happen sooner or later, and it happened. We got another question from inside the live event itself. If I show that. So Morgan's asking, how do we measure change in company culture? Oh, what a question. What a question.
All right. Okay. So I could take the easy way out and say, you don't. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you some ideas of how I would go about this. Let me, I moved my notes on the screen. So this kind of broadly to me falls into the HR category. And one thing there are a few things I could think about off the top of my head. So what about things like internal NPS? And I've seen companies do that, which is they look at net promoter scores in relation to, for instance, how likely is it that you will refer someone to apply for a job at this company or, want to work here. New employee referrals, retention rates and turnover rates, employee engagement, and employee engagement measures have improved. I mean, they're still kind of squishy, but they have improved. And you could also look at performance ratings, but I would caution you on that, especially if your performance evaluation and rating system is very lopsided. That is, if, for instance, someone's you have a manager and the team under that manager isn't really able to rate the performance of that manager. I think what was the buzzword some years ago, 360 reviews or something like that. That might be something that would be more useful in that respect. I see things like culture surveys, and I think that's, to me, somewhat of a low-hanging fruit, but it is a starting point. Like with anything, when we're trying to measure change in a company internally, we probably have to start with that low-hanging fruit, but we need to go beyond that to integrate some of these other measures. And I know that's a lot of work, but then again, investments in culture change are expensive. So you really should be making the case here to measure it as fully as possible.
Awesome stuff. And excitingly, I did get Andre's name right. So, yay. And he sent another question. So he asks, has it worked for you to use KPIs for learning objectives or learning by competencies, especially for quantitative measurements? Fantastic word, quantitative. Doesn't even sound real, but it's an awesome word.
So I mean, I'm excited when I see KPIs because that's sort of a good step in the right direction of measuring impact. Now, as the highly analytical person, I would always ask, is this the right KPI to measure? And is that KPI telling us the whole story? Because it may not. So that's a word of caution there, but I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Competencies are a little trickier because whenever I see competency, I ask myself, so what? So you're competent at explaining this product to a potential client. So what? So again, it's to me one aspect of the story, but we often want to and should dig a little deeper. Now, this is actually a good opportunity to make one really, really important point. I said in the beginning that training impact is, okay, maybe I didn't phrase it this way, but it's often tough to isolate. But that shouldn't dissuade you from measuring these things, because if we know from the way we've defined the problem and we've identified that training is one aspect of solving the problem, it's perfectly reasonable to measure the impact, even if we need to say an asterisk. It's not the case that 100% of training contributed to this outcome. There are going to be other factors involved. So, so in other words, well, if sales go up and we've done a reasonable job of ascertaining that training contributed to that, it's not on, we don't need to say that it's 100% of the reason why our sales go up, to claim success, if that makes sense. And when you look at some data analysis strategies like pre-post tests, for instance, or my favorite, regression analysis, we're definitely acknowledging that there are multiple factors that go into producing results. And we can, with some of these techniques, ascertain a little bit more, especially with regression analysis, how much of the increase in sales, the dollar amount or the pounds amount, British pounds amount, training contributed. And if you're like, regression analysis, I am an instructional designer, what the are you talking about? That's okay. That's why I generally think it's really, really good to have an actual data analyst on your learning and development and training design team. I just made another plug for myself, by the way.
That's fine. It's not a problem. Cool. So I think, looking at everything, that is all the questions as they currently stand. If you do have a burning question, now is the time. Oh no, we've got someone just sending us spam on Twitch. Fantastic. That's what we
Lovely.
like. Good news, everyone. If you want to become famous, this Twitch user can buy us followers. Do get in touch if you're interested in that. But more importantly, check out Anja on LinkedIn, as she's just shared the link in the chat. Anja, thank you so much. This was so interesting. I think this is an area where you're right. We need to do more, but what we do, we need to do better. As opposed to just blindly grabbing everything we can get hold of. There's already a discussion in the IDT Discord now about MPS and what data we should be gathering. So do come and get involved. And thank you ever so much, everyone. We will be back very shortly with our penultimate session. Just 2 sessions left now of our first event. The next event is with it's with Joey Sennett, the marketing of knowledge, my ID update buddy. So we shall be back very soon. Anja, thank you once again.